Imagine buying a brand new car in India today because the manufacturer says it's fully ready for E20. But if India raises the mainstream blend again in a few years, what happens to that car? You may have to keep using it with a fuel it was never designed for, and if you try to sell it, buyers might discount it because they're worried about exact same thing. So the uncertainty follows you whether you plan to keep the car for 10 years or sell in 3. That, to me, is a real problem with India's ethanol rollout. This is not just about mileage, it's about whether people can trust the fuel standard their vehicle was sold under. In this video, I want to look at the problems created by ethanol rollout and the issues people are reporting and the concerns that are not being discussed enough and what I think should happen next. Let me make my position very clear before we go any further. I think India is right to pursue ethanol. India imports close to 90% of the crude oil it consumes, and most of that has to be paid in foreign currency. So, when oil prices rise internationally, India pays more. When the rupee weakens against the dollar, it pays even more. And fuel prices are not strictly commuters' problem alone. Fuel price is one of the core drivers of inflation. Fuel costs are fed into transport, manufacturing, food prices, and almost everything else that has to be moved around in the country. So, essentially, this is everyone else's problem as well. Ethanol allows India to replace part of the petroleum used in petrol with the fuel that can be produced domestically from sugarcane, maize, and other feedstocks. That does not remove India's dependency on oil completely, but even replacing a portion of the petrol has value when the country consumes fuel at this scale. It also creates large and predictable market inside India for some crops. Farmers get another buyer, sugar mills and distilleries get demand, and a bit of national spending remains within the domestic economy rather than leaving the country through oil import bill. So, this is not a video arguing that India should abandon E20. The problem is that E20 became the practical default while the large part of existing domestic vehicle fleet had been designed around older fuel standards. These owners were given very little choice, a very little help, and no clear assurance that same thing would not happen again in the future. I found plenty of posts claiming E20 will destroy older engines, but very little evidence beyond individual cases. So, I can't validate the complete engine damaging effects of ethanol. However, the more credible concern is that some older vehicles may lose mileage, need certain parts replaced sooner, and become harder to sell as buyers start worrying about the compatibility issues. The government itself accepts the rubber parts and gaskets in some vehicles may need earlier replacement. That puts the owner of an aging vehicle in a difficult position. Understandable, right? Keeping the vehicle may cost more, but selling it to upgrade may also become harder if potential buyers are worried about the problems associated with ethanol. And underneath all of this confusion, there is a simple complaint I found to be a fair ask. I bought this vehicle under one fuel standard. The standard has changed while the vehicle was still completely useful. And the old fuel that is needed by this vehicle is effectively disappeared. Why is this my problem? I think this is the part government has not answered properly. You have to understand that India has a very mixed vehicle fleet. Some cars are built for E20 post 2023. Many older bikes and cars were designed around E10 standard, and there are premium or imported vehicles that may have their own fuel requirements. But the petrol network has largely moved on to a default blend of E20. Keeping E10 available alongside of E20 would need separate storage, transport and dispensing. So, it is easy to see why the system moved on towards a single standard. It's easy to execute logistically and administratively. The problem is that E20 was not added to existing options. It just became the only available option, while a lot of vehicles are better served with lesser blends such as E10. Mind you that this is not just older vehicle problem. There are some people out there with a premium or performance car may want fuel that matches the manufacturer recommendations and might be willing to pay more for it. So the loss of choice affects almost everyone. But in my understanding, the financial impact does not affect everyone equally. A wealthy owner can replace the vehicle earlier. They may not be happy about it, but they can usually absorb a small drop in mileage, pay for the repairs, and move on to a newer E20 ready model or even an EV, for example. But for some relying on a 10-year-old commuter bike, these options may not exist at all. Older cars and bikes remain on the road because that is what millions of families can afford in the first place. When the first owner upgrades, the vehicle moves into the second-hand market and becomes transport for someone with a smaller budget who may depend on it for everyday commute or work. So, surprisingly, the rollout hits hardest the section of society with the least room in its budget to absorb the change and the transition. That is what makes this transition really unfair. India gets the national benefit, the crop producers get the guaranteed market, and the fuel network becomes easier to manage because they only offer one standard, E20. But the people most exposed to the downside receive very little help in return. There is no meaningful discount at the pump, no widely available lower blend option, and no clear national support for owners who need to replace these damaged or vulnerable components because of E20 incompatibility, or upgrade the vehicle that is no longer suitable is not supported by the government. At this point, it's clear that ethanol is mainly an energy security and farmer economy policy. It's not a policy that is designed to make the fuel cheap. It replaces some imported oil with fuel produced by Indian farmers, mills, and distilleries. To make that work, the government protects the production side by setting the ethanol prices high enough to keep the industry viable. But it has not done anything similar for the consumer. The pump price did not fall, and for the drivers whose mileage dropped, the cost of every kilometer went up. The government could have absorbed some of that through lower taxes or retail discount, but instead, the producers were protected, government revenue was largely protected, and the affected driver was left to absorb the loss. And that is a serious miss because the people most affected are often owners of older vehicles, the very people with the least room to pay more to replace them. The next important part of this issue is uncertainty about what comes after E20. The government is already promoting flex fuel technology, and its long-term ethanol plans clearly go way beyond reaching E20. And I think that is right decision for the country. But most people buying an ordinary petrol car today are not buying a true flex fuel vehicle. They are buying one described as E20 compatible. So, what does that promise actually mean? Will E20 remain available for the normal life of that vehicle? And if the mainstream blend raises again, will today's E20 vehicle still have access to the fuel that they were designed for? Or will their owners simply be told to adjust? That matters because the cars and motorcycles remain on the road for many years and often pass through several owners for decades. The government does not need to freeze the fuel standards forever, but when people are making a major financial decision as buying a car, they are entitled to have some policy uncertainty around how long the standard they are buying into will be supported and what happens when it changes. So, with all that information, how do we go forward from here? I do not think India should reverse ethanol program or slow down the progress it has made. Reducing dependence on imported oil and building domestic fuel capacity is a commendable national initiative that deserves full support. But the next stage has to treat the consumer as a part of this transition rather than leaving them to absorb whatever cost the rollout creates. The first step is to restore some choice, such as E10 or another protection grade fuel, could remain available at selected stations for the vehicles that genuinely need it. The second is to help the people hit the hardest. Older vehicles may need some parts replaced sooner, and the government could help to cover some of its cost. And if a vehicle genuinely needs replacing, lower income owners should get meaningful help to upgrade from the government. Finally, the government needs to provide certainty about what comes next. Before raising the mainstream blend again, it should explain which vehicles can use it, what happens to the vehicle already on the road, and how long the previous vehicle standard will continue to be supported. And very importantly, that kind of guidance has to come before the rollout, not after people started complaining. In conclusion, ethanol is the right direction for India, but people also need to know that the vehicle they are buying today will not be abandoned by fuel policy of tomorrow. That is the assurance missing from this transition. So, if you drive a petrol vehicle in India, tell me, what have you actually noticed? Has the mileage changed? Have you faced any maintenance or compatibility issues already? And should a lower ethanol option still be available for vehicles that need it? If you have followed my plea until this point, I'm sure we have a lot more to discuss in the future. So please hit that like, subscribe, and hype the video. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, dig deeper.